how about we bring on our guest? What do you think?
Let's do it. Yeah.
All right. Well, our guest today is Ben Burgis. He is a philosophy professor. He also writes at Jacobin a lot. He's the host of the podcast Give Them an Argument, which I appear on once a month to talk about The Sopranos. He's also the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, and the brand new, spanking new book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left. You can find the link for that book in the description. You can also see it on your screen. Ben, welcome to the show. Thank you for being on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Ben, who are we canceling today? Just kidding.
Yeah, let's cancel someone.
I've got a list. I mean, you want me to start at the top, or it's no. I'm excited, of course, as I said, to talk to my favorite Latinx and AAPI.
Be very careful. I'm from Spain, and you're going to get me in trouble. I am not included in the catch-all term Latinx.
Okay. All right. Is there some is there some Latin Spanex, term that can
there should be. I guess I mean, to the extent that this debate is even like mind-numbingly boring, but like Hispanic does count. I guess I do count in Hispanic, but I do not count in Latino or Latinx. But what I am is an imperialist pig, and that is 100% true. Now,
you're Ben, representing the imperialist community.
Yes, the imperialist community. There is literally dozens of us. Okay, and it's about time that we're heard. Columbus, he was a hero, even though he was Italian. He flew under the Spanish flag. We're claiming him.
Speaking
of Italians that claim Columbus. Yeah, exactly. Now, Ben, I want to ask you about we're just joking about cancel culture, because there has been it's discussed a lot. There has been a sort of fight back against the concept of cancel culture. People say it does not exist. Even some people that I consider comrades and politically on my side say that it doesn't exist. I personally find that baffling, because just look around. But Ben, how would you define it? Maybe that's a good place to start.
Sure. So I think that what we call cancel culture, and it's an imperfect term for what it's meant to describe. I did a Jacobin talk. I think back then we were calling talk something else about this last year that people can check out, and an article for Jacobin called "So You're Still Being Publicly Shamed," where I got into this. But I think that it's what we're really talking about are a cluster of cultural trends towards basically mutual surveillance and hair trigger denunciation, which I think is really a disease of neoliberalism. I would argue that it's something that happens because we live in a society where people are incredibly atomized. They often feel most connected to other people online, where most people correctly think that they're relatively powerless, and if they can at least get somebody fired, that gets them some sense of power over something, where we have intentionally addictive social media platforms, that the for-profit corporations that run them want everybody to spend as much time staring at their phones as at all possible, and to have that little endorphin rush you get from likes and retweets, which can often be served by being the first to sort of lead a pile on against somebody, and by the fact that most Americans, not that this phenomenon is by any means restricted to the United States, but this is its toxic heart, work in non-unionized workplaces where doxing, for example, has a real terror for people. And it would have other dangers anyway, but especially given how many Americans work in places where they can be fired without cause anytime the boss is embarrassed by association with them. So I think that's a general problem that is a problem for the entire political spectrum. I think that we could easily talk about lots of examples of right-wing cancellations, and probably even more, most of all, examples, those sort of centrist liberal cancellations often directed against the left. But what I find really unfortunate, and you're kind of touching on, is that a lot of my friends and comrades on the left, rather than saying, yeah, this is a very real problem, and look, the left is actually in a position to not just complain about it, like sort of libertarians and centrists can, but to actually offer real solutions, like enhanced protections in the workplace, like nationalizing these social media platforms so we can run them in a more reasonable way rather than trying to rather than handling them the way that their current corporate overlords do. Rather than doing that, they say, oh, it doesn't exist. And in fact, it seems to me that they often kind of contradict themselves, because they'll say both it doesn't exist, right? When they're dismissing concerns about it, they'll say it doesn't exist. And then in other contexts, they'll say, oh, it's actually really important that we hold people accountable by canceling them online. That they'll say, oh, this is the accountability and consequences, and it always kind of skeezes me out, because when people start going on about accountability and consequences, they kind of start sounding like a suburban Republican who wants to lock up everybody who shoplifts. But I think that you can't really have it both ways, because if you say, oh, there's no such thing as cancel culture, canceling is just criticism, then how is that accountability for anybody? How is that a consequence? Just being criticized. Like, we all know, I think, the difference between criticism and hair trigger mass denunciation, especially when people try to invoke consequences like employment. That, like, just criticism wouldn't actually be a consequence for anything if you were really just criticizing what someone was saying, rather than trying to destroy their reputation, or rather than trying to run them out of their current job, or run them out of whatever institution you want them to experience consequences in. And last point, like, my focus in the book is really very specifically on the left, because even though I think this is something everybody does, it bothers me more when it happens on the left, because one, I think it's counter-solidaristic and really should be contrary to everything that we stand for. And two, I think that when you kind of combine those general cultural trends with the specific pathologies of the left that I'm sure we'll get into, you get this really toxic brew that makes most of the people that we need to try to persuade in order to win them over to some kind of socialist project want to run screaming in the opposite direction, because why would they want to have anything to do with people who act like this?
So I think on that note, when I was reading your book, I want to say, I like pretty much agreed with everything that you have to say about cancel culture and its relationship to the left. But I am not on Twitter, right? And actually, the reason why I'm not on Twitter is because of the dynamics that you discuss. So, I'm not saying
you would become the biggest canceller ever.
Exactly. I just know that I would be denouncing left and right. No, I mean, like, Twitter is like a horrible place, right? But which is all to say, when you identify these kinds of like counterproductive tendencies, like, I fully agree that they're there. However, when I was reading your book, I was like, well, like, isn't this still just mostly online? And like, of course, you've already spoken a little bit about how that shades into real life. But when I was reading, I was like, okay, but like, there's a lot of examples from like online, and like, not saying that's not real, but like, is this like, could this be solved just by, like, getting rid of social media or something? Yeah, exactly. Logging off. Should we all just log off? But then actually last week, an interesting thing happened in my neighborhood, coincidentally. Let's watch the video.
Fuck out of New York. We don't want you here. 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 We don't want your fucking money. We don't want your fucking money. We don't want your fucking taqueria. Owned by fucking white men. Owned by fucking white men. Tip 30%. Tip 30%. Tip 30%. Anybody over here that's not tipping right?
All right, so just as some context, Ben's eyes are like very wide. What's going on in this video is there was a march in Brooklyn after the Derek Chauvin verdict came in, and a group of, left-wing activists were going down Vanderbilt Avenue, stopped in front of this taqueria, which they say is owned by a white man, but the neighborhood chatter is that it's actually a Mexican-American family. Anyway, that's neither here nor there.
They could be white.
They could be white. They could be white. We don't know. Let's just, even
Mexicans
if they were.
Can be white.
Mexicans can be
That's
white.
where you get very complicated.
I should just interject this. I lived in South Florida for 6.5 years. I knew tons of people from Latin America, who are like, weird right-wing counter-revolutionaries, who would definitely be insulted if you suggested that they weren't white.
Yeah. All right. So fair enough. But to the video that we just watched, basically this was an expression of, I guess, radical anti-gentrification sentiment. Ben, what do you make of this radical vanguard? What does this group of people say about some of the pathologies you talk about in your book?
I'd say if the guy who was standing up there leading that chant isn't actually on the police payroll, then as a matter of labor, I'm a little upset on his behalf because he's doing all this service for them for free. It's insane. I mean, like, clearly, what really jumps out at me from that clip and from others I remember like that from last summer of people sort of crowding in and yelling in the faces of outdoor diners and demanding that they make some symbolic gesture of support is the same thing, for that matter, that I remember jumping out at me in 2019 watching the infamous clips from the DSA convention that year. I'm a member of the DSA and don't plan on ever not being a member of it, but that nobody who's involved in these things seems to have any part of their brain that thinks, hey, I wonder how people who aren't already on board are going to receive this. Like, I wonder how this is going to play with anybody who's not basically soaking in the subculture of a certain kind of left activism, right? What is somebody in the wider world going to make of this? I mean, somebody from any background in the wider world, just anybody who's not completely acculturated into the left, going to make of it when they see people screaming, we don't want you here, at people who are just like ordinary people trying to eat at a Mexican restaurant because the owner of the restaurant is allegedly white. What are people going to make of it when you see people at the DSA convention say nobody is allowed to clap because it's not impossible that out of 1,000 delegates there are 3 of them that have some incredibly rare condition that makes them especially sensitive to loud noises, and nobody's allowed to use the phrase "Hey guys" because it's gendered language. And what disturbs me is that they don't even seem to be thinking about it, which unfortunately I think makes a lot of sense, given one of the things that I try to trace in the book in terms of the trajectory of the left in the last several decades, which is that in the last few years, there have started to be some openings for the radical left to participate more in real world politics, most obviously the 2 Bernie campaigns, the rise of DSA. And it's tentative, but the door of political possibility is at least starting to open a crack. But unfortunately, I think we have a lot of really bad habits left over from the decades in which the left was wandering in exile, when even decent social democrats like Bernie in the U.S. or Jeremy Corbyn in the U.K. Were pretty obscure backbenchers, and anything more radical than that was completely off the table. And if you came up in that, it, I think, makes sense that you thought of radical politics not really as a serious project to try to change the world, which would of course involve trying to appeal to the broad mass of regular people who'd be completely alienated by stuff like this, but as a symbolic thing, as a way of symbolically taking a stand against all of the injustices of capitalism and imperialism and everything else. And unfortunately, I think even a lot of very young activists, who've only recently, started to be involved in the left, have really inherited that mindset that it's really just about symbolically performing your opposition to the injustices of the system. And if that's all it is, it's very natural that you spend a lot of time interrogating other people's commitment, right? Is everybody else really committed enough or not? And that you spend a lot of time sort of fighting for credibility within a certain bubble, or really trying to prove how hardcore you are. Like, I'm going to lead the chant against the taqueria, rather than thinking about how is it that we can appeal to the broadest possible subset of the population, the vast number of working class people that we'd have to appeal to in order to actually take power and carry out our program.
So, sorry, I want to follow up on that really quickly, because you wrote something really interesting in your book where, you say something along the lines of, even if you are spending hours doing good work, you're spending hours with your local DSA organizing, but you go online for a couple minutes each day to do some canceling, that's still ultimately detrimental to the left. And with the with the video that we just watched, like, what if those people are doing great organizing, or actually maybe a better example is, like, we've seen hundreds or thousands of protests over the last year, and most of them have not had crazy elements like that, right?
Sure, of course.
So I guess the question is, if there's a lot of good work going on, you make the argument in your book that a little bit of this bad behavior is still detrimental in a way. Can you expand on that a little?
Yeah. So when you say, canceling comedians while the world burns, which of course is taken as a representative example, and also it alliterates, so I like that, of all of the sort of pathological self-defeating things that the left does. The point of that analogy, right, like Nero fiddling while Rome burned, is to say that something counterproductive is being done in an emergency. But argue in the book that it's actually worse than that, because it's not just a matter of what people are spending their time on, right? It's not just an issue of, you're doing this when you should be spending all of your time doing this other thing. There are lots of things that people could spend no more time doing that they're spending on this stuff that would at least just be neutral, right? And then, of course, the very clever response you get from a lot of people is, "Oh, so you're complaining about this, while the world burns?" Well, I think sending the signal to people who would be completely alienated by this behavior, that there are lots of people on the left who don't like it, I would argue is actually politically useful. But I think that the larger point is, as you indicate, that even if this is a tiny amount of your time that you spend doing stuff like this, even if you do really good work, the rest of your time, that you have every once in a while you go shrilly denounce somebody over nonsense, but the rest of your time you spend on union organizing, you spend on DSA stuff, then that small amount of time that you spend doing this other stuff is still a problem, in a way that it wouldn't be a problem if you'd spent the same amount of time, getting high and playing video games, because during the time that you spent doing this, you contributed to putting the left in a light, to making people see the left in a light that is going to be deeply alienating to the overwhelming majority of people. It's already hard enough to try to convince people to care about politics in the first place, that to think that politics can actually solve their problems, to think that some kind of left project isn't just completely delusional utopian fantasy stuff. But that's already difficult enough without adding in, oh yeah, and also this club that we want you to join is composed of people who have a problem, who want to ban clapping and have a huge problem with it if you get a taco at a Mexican restaurant that might be owned by a white guy.
Yeah, I think about the latest example of the Bachelor controversy, which I can't one of the most popular shows on television. I mean, that one to me has been I can't think of a more self-defeating thing than that one. But as people might say, okay, yeah, you're doing the same thing, right? You're critiquing the left while the world burns, forgetting that Karl Marx spent 90% of his time owning various people on the left who he disagreed with about something that I don't have the time to read about. But what do you say? What do you think is to put on the Marxist hat? What's the material base? What are the material conditions undergirding this phenomenon?
Yeah, which actually, by the way, reminds me of my favorite quote from Marx on Bakunin. It's from a letter to Engels, so at least he wasn't saying this in public, but it says, Bakunin has become a monster, a huge mass of flesh and fat, and is barely capable of walking anymore. And
Hell yeah.
he sort of goes on and on from there, but really did not like that guy. But yeah, but he also spent tons of time critiquing the ideas of your Bakunins and Proudhons and Lassalle's and various other people on the left because he thought there were important things that they were getting wrong and that the left needed to get right. I would actually argue. So I want to, I guess, maybe split off the part of your question about the material base because I think that's really important. But just to wrap up the first thought, I'd say that that there are two reasons why it's actually valuable to critique the left. It's not actively destructive, like doing the no clapping, denouncing people over nonsense, saying everybody who disagrees with you about 1.5 points is basically Nancy Pelosi, all of that stuff. But it's also not just neutral, in the getting high and playing video games category. I think it's actually politically valuable. I think it's politically valuable for two reasons. One is that I believe that lots of leftists who act in all of the different ways that I talk about in the book that I think are counterproductive are well-intentioned people who are just used to doing things in a certain way and might actually be receptive to a critique and start doing things in a different way. And so I think that can have some value, that it can actually help convince some people on the left not to act this way and thus not to do things that sabotage our political project. And then the other reason is the one I kind of alluded to earlier, which is that I think that even if this falls on completely deaf ears on everyone in the left, which I think is too pessimistic, I think that when this critique is made, and a lot of people don't want to make it because, of course, you don't become a leftist or a socialist in the first place because you want to argue with crazy people about nonsense. You become one because you want to fry much bigger fish about capitalism and imperialism and police violence and all of those things. So it's understandable that lots of people who roll their eyes at the things being criticized in the book just steer clear of that fight. But when this critique is raised, I think some people are persuaded by it and will actually, unironically do better. But the other reason is that I think that even if it falls on completely deaf ears, even if nobody, who's currently on the left is receptive to it, which I think is too pessimistic, then it's still useful because it sends a signal that this is not a club that you have to become a antisocial weirdo who reminds people of the guy from the HR department to join. That this is that there are much more appealing people in there, that there are people who are just as frustrated by all the stuff about the left that might frustrate you as you are, but also think that it's important to pursue a radical left political project. And I think that itself has useful outrage potential. Finally, on the question of the material base, I think it's complicated. I don't want to reduce it just to this, but I do think that part of the problem here is that so many people who are currently involved in the left are either downwardly mobile members of what's sometimes called the professional managerial class, or at the very least, the downwardly mobile sons and daughters of the professional managerial class. And that, unfortunately, the consequence of that is, and I'm not saying that to say, screw them then, right? We don't want them. Look, I have, my day job is as PMC as it gets, but my point instead is to say that people should be aware of the fact that when they come to the socialist left, oftentimes as a result of the fact that a lot of these PMC jobs are becoming more economically precarious, and so they correctly see their economic interests as aligned with a more left-wing program, they carry with them a lot of the acculturation and a lot of the habits of the PMC, which unfortunately do oftentimes involve a lot of backstabbing as people sort of climb over each other to get up professional and managerial hierarchies. And again, I think it's not a coincidence that a lot of what I talk about in the book, a lot of what Mark Fisher describes in his classic essay, Exiting the Vampire's Castle, like sounds a lot like a left-tinged version of a visit from the HR department.
Yeah. So I guess I wanna follow up on that by asking you, and I think you've already like gotten at a little bit of this, but I feel like one of the criticisms of like worrying about cancel culture that I hear on the left is, as you pointed out, some people will say like, oh, well, the problem isn't cancel culture. The problem is at-will employment, where your boss can fire you for your political beliefs out of work or really for any reason that they want. Or, the problem isn't cancel culture. The problem is a system where private corporations can really just do as they please. So what we should be focusing on is not really cancel culture proper, but, we should be focusing on ending at-will employment, or we should be focusing on checking the power of corporations. And obviously you would agree with both of those points, but talk a little bit about why, like why cancel culture is sort of the word that you chose, instead of writing a book about like the how bad at-will unemployment is, at-will employment.
Yeah, I mean, to answer the last part of the question first, the reason that I didn't, write a book about that is that I think among the people I'm primarily trying to talk to in this book, which are people who already identify with the left and its political project, they already know that. Right?
Yeah.
This is not news to them that capitalism is really bad. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, there's no value to explaining why capitalism is really, really bad. In fact, that's what I spend like most of my time doing in one form or another. But I think that for the purpose of this book, I'm trying to talk to people who already know all of that, who already have, from my perspective, a lot of the right normative and political commitments, but who I think are doing things that undermine the possibility of success of that project. As far as the issue about cancel culture and at-will employment, I think that there's certainly a germ of truth to that. Like I said earlier, I think that in a world without at-will employment, doxing, for example, would not have some of the terrors that it has for most American workers right now. Now, that's not to say that it would not have any terrors. I think that just sort of like harassment by random people is a bad thing, and that people quite rationally don't like that and see it as a problem when it happens to them. I don't think that the idea that purely psychological harms just sort of don't count is a really weird one to me, especially because some of the people who are most insistent about how psychological harms don't count when it comes to 1,000 strangers screaming at somebody that they're a racist or a fascist, over some innocuous thing, are exactly the same people who are very insistent, correctly in my view, that psychological harms do count when they're talking about something like, sexist harassment online. So I think that there's a weird inconsistency there. I'd also say that the instinct behind saying no, just don't talk about this cancel culture stuff, right? Don't talk about the way that these cultural and technological trends in our late stage neoliberal hellscape has made the way we interact with each other so toxic, or the ways that affects the left. Don't talk about that, right? Only talk about the stuff that is like a couple steps further down the line, what we're going to do about it. And I think that's a mistake just politically, because I think most people who have interacted with this phenomenon are going to have the same reaction that Nando had earlier, just being baffled when people say, oh, no, this doesn't exist. This is no problem. Ignore the man behind the curtain. None of this is really happening. When they can see with their own eyes that it is happening. And I think if you say, no, none of that's happening, ignore that, anybody who says that is really a Republican, you might as well be Tucker Carlson. I think that is really self-defeating, and that's just not going to get us a good hearing with the people that we're trying to convince for the solutions that we have to offer to this, like ending at-will employment, like rebuilding the labor movement, like nationalizing the social media platforms, like just rebuilding the left in general, so that people don't feel quite so powerless all the time, and the appeal of, hey, at least I got to be part of completely humiliating this person doesn't have so much appeal.
One of the arguments you make in your book is not really a political one, but more a cultural one, that all this stuff has a nefarious effect on culture. In specifically, you talk about comedy, that this stuff that has like ruined comedy, and it's not to like be like a Sebastian Maniscalco type right wing comedian who's like, oh, everyone's so offended right now about everything, but I do find that the effect on not just comedy but the culture writ large is very, very nefarious. That like if you like or if you listen to "Baby It's Cold Outside" at a Christmas party and don't immediately go and call out the person who put it on, you're participating in rape culture. Or if you're or that only people of a certain minority group can portray animate like in an animated show, someone like that kind of thing has a nefarious effect on actors of that minority group, because it limits their potential roles, as well as this idea that you have to be of a certain group to be able to write a novel in the voice of someone else, or a character within a novel in the voice of someone else, like that. It's like it's weirdly segregation-y. For choose a term that I just invented.
I know that you're personally very upset that there are multiple movies based on The Sun Also Rises and For Whom the Bell Tolls that were made
exactly
by Spaniards. Like that's not
exactly. Ernest Hemingway was vicious appropriator of my culture. But yeah, I mean, I just beyond the political valence of all this stuff, it has undoubtedly had a horrible effect on the culture, in which like a movie like Promising Young Woman, which is nominated for every single award, just won the Independent Spirit Award for best screenplay and things like that. Like it is like a movie in which every scene basically says like, this is the message I want to send to you, and and I will be the most on the nose thing ever. Like it's created a culture in which like we have to deliver a message, and that message has to be explicit, and it has to be there is no nuance or conflict or complexity and all that stuff. And it's just, I don't know, like I found that line of critique very, very convincing in your book.
Yeah, so the opening chapter is about the comedy wars, and it sort of transitions from there to the broader set of subjects that I wanted to tackle in the book. And I think that I wanted to start out by talking about that stuff for a couple reasons. One, because I think it's one of the places where there's a certain kind of allegedly progressive moralism that is most on display culturally that I really hate for a lot of reasons, and I also think is really counterproductive when the left signs on to it. And I think that it's also bad in itself, right? And this is something that, of course, I want to be a good materialist and focus on changing, material conditions, and sometimes that focus can shade into just saying that culture doesn't matter or you should ignore it. But I think that that's ultimately a mistake. The person who really convinced me of that more than anybody else is the late Michael Brooks, who talked about this a lot, and this is how he ended his book Against the Web, by talking about how the left should have a vision of how we want culture to be. This isn't ground, as much as we should focus on economics and material conditions. This isn't ground that we can profitably just completely concede and sort of never mention. And of course, his vision in there is cosmopolitan socialism, where you have people moving around and mixing and picking up and discarding the pieces of each other's cultural inheritance that they like as they please, without really worry, certainly without prejudice or discrimination, but also without worrying about cultural appropriation, because socialists shouldn't believe in some sort of like weird ethno-nationalist collective intellectual property that everybody has, by virtue of being born into a culture, or lacks by virtue of not being born into it. And of course that sort of cosmopolitan mixing and cultural expression is going to be the most meaningful under socialism, when you don't have certain cultural classes of the population who are being kept as a impoverished underclass, like we obviously do under capitalism. Specifically on what you're talking about, yeah, I mean, I think that that there are a couple of different things going on here that are related to each other, certainly. One of them is this sort of weird essentialism about race and culture and other things that sometimes shades into this weird kind of woke segregationism. I just saw somebody on Twitter yesterday, since unfortunately I've not been as wise as Jed, I haven't logged off yet, talking about how at the media company, it's like a progressive media company that they used to work for, there was like an HR diversity training where the white people were supposed to go in sort of one room to do a session with one trainer, and the people of color were supposed to go into another, and there was one person there who was mixed race, had one white parent and one Indian American one, and sort of nervously asked which one they were supposed to go to, because you have to sort these things out, which seems, again, not terribly culturally progressive to me. And then, of course, a lot of this gets mixed up with a kind of censorious moralism, which I think really impacts a lot of the examples that you're talking about. And yeah, one of the claims that I do make in the comedy chapter is that this is really bad. Look, for comedy as an art form, which is at its best what it can be. And I think a lot of American liberals and even some leftists get really confused about this point, and they think that comedy is like a tool for bringing about social change, which it's absolutely not. I think that's just total nonsense. And so I think both the willingness of so many progressives to like go to the Jon Stewart, rally to restore sanity 10 years ago, is the flip side of the willingness to sort of moralistically attack somebody like Dave Chappelle over these weird literalistic interpretations of jokes made in a stand-up set. I think both of those show this idea that comedy is really politically important in a way that I think is just not. What it is entertainment, and at its best, it can be a form of art, something that says something, about the human condition. But for both purposes, this kind of moralism is just terrible. And it's terrible on all sides because anybody who's like a moralistic scold is going to be a terrible art critic of any kind, because they're going to be weird and literalistic about everything. They want to sort everything into being clearly good and clearly bad, when oftentimes the best art rides the ambiguities. And it also creates god-awful super woke comedy, and that kind of clapter comedy that's really supposed to inspire clapping, more than laughter. And it also inspires a lot of god-awful anti-woke comedy, which is in fact gotten so pervasive that oftentimes, even with the really good stuff, even with people like Bill Burr that I really enjoy, for like a really good album, you might have to sit through 5 to 10 minutes of really tedious, predictable, sort of anti-woke, you can't tell a joke anymore stuff before you get to the interesting and funny part. And I think the whole thing is just awful for comedy, and I think it's probably awful for a lot of other art forms too. I think that I don't think that the best art, the best entertainment, the most interesting cultural expressions arise from like weird polarized moral panics.
So we've talked a little bit about, the part of the left that kind of denies cancel culture, but I also want to ask you about the small segment of the left that promotes cancel culture, specifically. So this is like.
Sorry, Jen. My dog is going nuts. She really wants to be let out of the room. Give me just a second.
I thought I heard a dog.
Let her out.
Ben, what kind of dog do you have? It sounded small.
Yeah, miniature.
Okay. Yeah. So pro-canceling. So what I wanted to say was the argument, I guess, in favor of canceling that I have heard from the left is, when you talk about cancel culture, what you're really talking about is marginalized people who are speaking up for themselves or fighting back. And when you say they shouldn't do that, you're advocating a kind of form of respectability politics. When you say you don't like woke, the new like woke culture that you guys were just talking about, like, well that's just because you must be a reactionary who liked the old unwoke culture. I find this argument so frustrating, but I never really know how to respond, especially to the claim, of marginalization, that, cancel culture is actually just marginalized people fighting back. Please give us an answer, or give us an argument. Sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, that's what you're supposed to be doing. You're the give them the argument man.
Okay. It's like the say the line part. You know,
Yeah.
Right.
an argument.
Dance, monkey, dance.
Fair enough. So I guess the short answer is that I don't think so. I think, in fact, if you look at some polling data about how people think about this, who are actually members of marginalized group, you'll find that hyper wokeness is largely an elite phenomenon. To be fair, I also think that hyper anti-wokeness is largely an elite phenomenon. These are mostly struggles that take place over, that like the people who get the most excited about this are often fighting about like how their private school that most people would have to get a second mortgage to send their kids to should do its anti-racism day or whatever. But I think that. Unfortunately, again, my reason for being interested in this is that a lot of it infects the culture of the left in really unhelpful ways. And I'd say that we can make some common sense distinctions between not being a bigot and being performatively ultra woke. Right? So you can say that of course you should not be an asshole about calling trans people by their requested pronouns, but also without having to say that ContraPoints is a terrible person and secretly hates non-binary people because of your interpretation of something that she tweeted once in 2019 and something else that she tweeted once in 2017. I don't think it's actually hard, particularly hard to ride that distinction, that you can be interpersonally respectful, that you can certainly support any number of anti-discrimination efforts that actually have really important real-world consequences for things like employment and housing, without indulging in this kind of performative ultra-wokeness that seems to primarily be about signaling that you have the right moral commitments, and castigating other people who you suspect don't have those moral commitments, which I would actually argue in practice, and I don't want to be too much of a vulgar Marxist about this, like I'm suggesting that there are some guys
You should be.
Yeah.
in top hats in a smoke-filled room, like plotting this out as a strategy. But I will say that in practice, it's oftentimes the case that sort of ultra woke cultural signaling is something that has the effect of demobilizing and disempowering popular movements that actually could win real gains for marginalized people. So I think the obvious recent example of this is there was last summer, of course, there was an unprecedented wave of unrest after the murder of George Floyd, and of course, the things that most activists would really want were things that would reduce the power of the police and help make it harder for them to brutalize people as they manage the social effects of poverty. So, doing things like banning the sale of surplus military equipment to police departments, doing things that would make it easier, perhaps having, not just symbolic toothless community review boards, but ones that were really empowered to fire bad cops, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But changing the way that policing works in America is an incredibly heavy political lift. And so oftentimes what these efforts got diverted into in practice were this kind of performative moral signaling and getting mad at people who weren't performatively signaling in the right way. So, for example, a good friend of mine who is a podcaster who, at the time of this story, lived in Brooklyn, and I think by saying that I've just narrowed that down to about 5,000 people I think we're talking about. I remember telling me that summer that people were barraging the Facebook page of his neighborhood beer bar because they hadn't made a statement about Black Lives Matter yet, even though they actually hadn't used their public Facebook page at all in months, since the pandemic started. But of course, since they hadn't done this,
their silence is deafening. I'm still deaf.
Their silence
still deaf.
Deafening. Or my all-time favorite example at the same time, there was a theater producer in New York who put together an open source Google Doc of all of the theater producers around the country who hadn't made some sort of symbolic statement of support, which is literally an open source denunciation list. I can't imagine how that could be abused. But also, it's just total nonsense. Who is the person who's like a police chief or an elected official who wasn't going to go along with some police reform initiative, but now if the theater tells them to, right? Like they saw a really awesome off-Broadway show at that theater, and so if they tell them to, they'll start.
I stopped being racist when I saw Fruit by the Foot
and Gushers
Gushers and Gushers tweet out support for Black Lives Matter. I was like, you know what?
I'm in.
Yeah.
I'm in, baby.
Who are the big winners?
They're delicious.
I also
marginalized people who are worried about being brutalized by the cops. They're getting literally nothing out of that. The big winners, I actually think this goes back to Jed's discussion earlier of the AAPI issue. The big winners of this are people who are middle class professionals or above. Who can sort of wrangle this discourse in order to sort of edge out members of other groups in fights about climbing certain kinds of managerial and professional and political ladders, and I think that it's the whole thing is in effect a shell game. It doesn't appeal to most working class members of marginalized groups, and it does have the effect in practice, even if it's not a conspiracy by anybody, of diverting movements from change for things that could actually be more useful and substantive in the real world. That would be my case.
So I think the final question for you has to be, how do we get out of this morass? How does the left exit the vampire's castle, so to speak? Because you had mentioned the Bernie Sanders campaign, which obviously sort of rose and fell last year. Right. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, it had a kind of like disciplinary is like maybe too strong of a word, but I felt like I personally saw way less of like this bad behavior or just like default to cancel culture when there was the Bernie campaign going on, because there was something for people to focus their energy on, or at least it was easier for those of us who don't want to have anything to do with the canceling to be like, well, I'm gonna make some calls for Bernie today, or the campaign was like a guiding light or something. Sadly, that's over, and of course we mourn it every day, but in the absence of a kind of vehicle like that, what can the left do to break out of this rut?
Yeah, I mean, so this is really difficult because I don't actually think that we can will we can just sort of will a better left into existence by wanting it hard enough. I think that there are certain things that we can do that can help sort of curb the worst of the toxicity of the existing left and help sort of point people towards something better. But unfortunately, I do think that ultimately we are going to need some of those political developments in the real world to be better. I mean, I remember, I started writing this book at the end of 2019. And by the time I was revising it and putting in the sort of appendix about the post-George Floyd protests, obviously, things, the Bernie campaign was already gone. But I remember, there were points that I'll admit to this. I was thinking, man, a book about how badly the left messes up and how we need to get our collective heads out of our asses is going to play really weirdly if Bernie Sanders is president in 2021. The DSA is like 10 times its current size, and there's all this great organizing going on.
Yeah, we wish your book was obsolete.
Yeah. No, I wish my book was obsolete. I would take that one for the team. But unfortunately, I think since the fall of the Bernie campaign, and especially since the election, the general election was over, I think that a lot of times the left hasn't really known what to do with itself. And there's this sense that door of political possibility that was starting to open a crack might be starting to close again. I think a lot of people are panicky about that. And I think that sort of disorientation, the lack of something in the real world, not that, everything that happened around the Bernie campaign was perfect by any means. I talk about a couple.
He is perfect.
Yeah, he himself is personally,
yes,
perfect. But it's like the czar is wonderful, but his evil boyars, are
sure.
They have there are, I think that if you look, there are unfortunately cases where even people who were supporters of the Bernie campaign, for example, we're sort of going along with the shit stirring about Joe Rogan about a year ago. That's an obvious example I talk about in the book. I saw many people with that Democratic Socialist red rose emoji, in their Twitter handles. Oh, it's really bad. He shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have accepted the endorsement of this terrible person, Joe Rogan, and people in left media, who are going along with that message. I think if you look at what happened with the campaign sort of folding to after the Daily Beast outed a lot of the private tweets of Ben Mora and firing him. I think that this stuff was present even there, but I think you're absolutely right, Jen. This was somewhat curbed by the fact that there was this really promising thing going on in the real world that everybody could kind of coalesce around and center their energies on. And the lack of that, I think, has led to a lot of really toxic and destructive things. I think that people. Certainly if you look at how, like when Force the Vote happened in December and January, what was actually an extremely minor disagreement about a parliamentary tactic was led to sort of a lot of, excommunications. Anybody who disagrees with me about this is a fake leftist, and, I want nothing more to do with them. And they probably, work for the CIA or, whatever. I think that that's the kind of thing that unfortunately we might see a lot more of. I think the question is what can we do that would avoid it? And I think that the part of the most important thing we can do is to log off and seek out real world organizing efforts. And for related to the labor movement, related to Medicare for All canvassing, things like that. And I think that can have some value. And I hope to try to convince some people to try to approach this stuff in a healthier way. But I think that even until we get something new that's like really big, that can have the kind of gravitational pull that the Bernie campaign had, I think that until then, I think just sort of planting the flag for a more reasonable and appealing version of the left, can mitigate some of the damage, or at least I really, really hope so.
Well, Ben, that's as good a place as any to end it. Thank you so much for joining us. The first thing you can do to exit the vampire's castle is read Ben's new book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left. Folks, we got a sneak peek of it. Yeah, I very much enjoyed it. You will too, I promise. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, comrades.